Today, I'd like to talk to you about a value proposition and how you can use a value proposition to win more sales. Value propositions, by their very definition, need to be a financially compelling argument to support the case you're putting forward to your customer. Very often, some of the value propositions I see are unquantified. They're sort of statements loosely that are called benefits, but they're kind of wishy-washy and they just don't cut it. Part of the reason for that is it takes a great deal of effort to create a truly compelling, financially strong value proposition. But if you get it right, your chances of winning are infinitely greater than trying to do it in some sort of haphazard way. So, a few things to note. First off, a value proposition has to be expressed in numbers. And those numbers are the outcomes of whatever action it is you're proposing to your client. You get to the numbers when you're actually sat in front of the client and you go through the questioning phase. And the whole point of that phase is to dig down into the client's business, try to understand the problems, but turn the problems into things that are measurable, to figure out what the financial impacts of this situation are and what the financial impacts of fixing it could be. So as you're talking and as you're discussing, you're looking for things you can measure. And they can be a whole host of things. Now, the very obvious ones are profitability, revenues, costs, but they can be anything that you can measure. Anything that you can measure and turn into money can be a very strong part of your value proposition. The key is metrics, numbers, timescales. The second stage is just as important as the first, because the first stage is you're going through trying to figure out what the problem is. The second stage is you're asking the client how they would solve the problem and what the outcomes of that might be. And if you do it right, you're ending up with two sets of numbers, a set of numbers of how it is and a set of numbers of how it could be. And hopefully that difference is big enough to more than justify the case you're putting forwards. The other dimension of this one is it needs to take some consideration of time. And by that I mean the client's time frames. If the client is dealing in a 3-year budgeting cycle, for example, and you go back with a cost justification over 5 years, you've got an instant mismatch. So one of the things you need to look for as you're going through is, what is the client's time frame and how can you make sure that the time frame you put forward in the value proposition matches up with that? The next big tripwire that catches out bid teams putting value propositions together are gaps in the knowledge. And it happens to everybody. You go and have a great meeting with a client and you talk through a subject in depth. And when you get back to the office, you discover there's a gap. And the temptation is to either make an assumption of what that figure could be, or worse, guess at it. And what I strongly suggest is, if you've had a good enough meeting with the client, they're going to be perfectly receptive to a phone call from you to clarify what is this piece of data. And that way you have an end-to-end situation that uses the client's numbers all the way. The minute you try and guess or assume what a number might be, you've just destroyed the credibility of your value proposition, because you can guarantee it's the one number the client is going to pick on when they start going through the case you're putting forwards. And that leads us to our next very important point. Whatever numbers you're using in a value proposition have to be the client's numbers, not yours. And you have to confirm them with them. So when you go and have your meeting with a client and you gather up the metrics that are going to support the business case you're going to put forward, it really matters that you confirm those numbers back to the client, both face-to-face in the meeting and in an email afterwards. Now the next obvious question is, what are the numbers? What are you trying to get? What are you trying to get to the bottom of? Now the obvious ones are increasing profitability, that's a very obvious one. Increasing revenues is another very obvious one. One that's not quite so obvious, but is very relevant in today's world, is, are you increasing cash flow? Because if you are, that's something that can have significant costs for a business today. The next one is obviously costs, and there can be two types of this. There can be costs you're eliminating by doing something different, or costs you're avoiding by stepping around an issue and doing it in a slightly different way. And the final thing to look for are other quantifiable benefits. Like, is there going to be an increase in market share? And if so, what's that worth? That's another example. But there can be lots of other figures that are important to the client in the way they do their business that you need to keep a track of. And that brings a final point around the question of numbers in a value proposition. And that's that you need to figure out what the order of importance of these things is to the client. So if they're backed up against the wall and they're trying to make cost savings, clearly that's number one. If, on the other hand, they're in a business that's expanding, maybe revenue growth is number one. But whichever, you need to figure out what the order of importance of these points is to your client. Then we get to the point whereby you've assembled all the numbers and you've assembled the value proposition, and if you've done it right, it should be a complete summary of what it is you're saying. Because if you look at this whole picture, it's quantifying what the customer's problem is in money, it's quantifying the benefits they're going to get in money, it's quantifying the investment they're going to make to buy the solution from you, it's quantifying the return they're going to get. So on one piece of paper, hopefully, or even if you're very good at this, a couple of paragraphs, you should be able to summarise the complete financial deal and what the benefit in it is to the customer. And that clearly is the major part of whatever executive summary or whatever proposal you're going to submit to make your case. So I suggest that having a strong value proposition is probably one of the most important things in making sales today. The first thing is it helps you make more sales, and the second fundamental benefit to this is at some point you're going to meet the client's buying team and the negotiating team, and they're going to be looking for savings. And if you've got a strong financial case for what it is you're putting forward, it's much more difficult for them to shave your price right down to the bone. Sure, there's going to be concessions, but you can manage that much better when you understand the value that you're delivering to your clients. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.